The air in the hospital corridor smells like cheap sanitizer and old fear. That smell had been my life for 3 months now. My son, Daniel, is 7 years old. He has the kindest smile and a rare cardiac defect that demanded immediate, complex intervention. The hospital staff called it a high-risk, high-cost procedure. To me, it was just Daniel's next birthday. The doctors had been clear. The surgery needed to happen within the next 30 days. Every day we waited was a roll of the dice with his tiny heart. We had followed every rule. We paid every premium. For 12 years, my employer deducted the maximum amount for the best platinum plan offered by OmniSecure Health. I never used it. I never complained. I just paid. The moment the specialist gave us the schedule, I submitted the pre-authorization claim. They promised a decision within 10 business days. 10 days stretched into 20. 20 days became 30. The uncertainty was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I stopped sleeping. I started running scenarios in my head, listing every contingency, calculating loan options, emptying savings accounts. Then the call came, not from a care coordinator, but from the claims review department. The voice on the other end was slow, smooth, and deliberately sterile. His name was Mr. Wakefield, an adjuster, a man whose entire job was to decide which lives were worth OmniSecure's balance sheet. He didn't ask how Daniel was doing. He didn't offer sympathy. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his tone suggesting I was wasting his time. "I am calling regarding claim ID 8713C for your dependent Daniel Hayes." My palms were sweating, clutching the cell phone until my knuckles were white. "Yes, Mr. Wakefield. Have you approved the procedure yet? We need to schedule this week." There was a calculated pause on his end, the kind of silence a lawyer uses before delivering a fatal blow. "Mrs. Hayes, after extensive review of the necessary documentation, the medical necessity of this particular procedure, and the highly specialized, and I must stress, highly expensive, surgical team proposed by the Metropolitan Children's Hospital, we have made a determination." My breath hitched. I could hear Daniel humming a cartoon theme song quietly in the background, oblivious to the man holding his future hostage. "And that determination is?" I asked, my voice a painful whisper. "It has been formally denied. The claim is non-compliant with our established protocols." The world tilted. I tried to stabilize myself against the cheap wall of the waiting room. "Denied? On what grounds?" The surgeon explicitly stated, "This is the only procedure that guarantees long-term viability." We submitted 3 referral letters. Mr. Wakefield sighed, a loud, exaggerated sound that clearly communicated how tiresome my anxiety was for him. "Mrs. Hayes, we understand this is difficult news, but the primary reason for denial is this. The proposed surgical intervention is deemed elective at this stage. Further, the cost is deemed excessive when compared to more standardized treatment protocols available at in-network facilities." He didn't say, "The facility you chose is too good for people like you." But I heard it anyway. Metropolitan Children's Hospital was the best in the state. They dealt specifically with cases like Daniel's. The alternative he was suggesting was a generalized community hospital known for high error rates in pediatric cardiac care. I felt the familiar, hot rush of humiliation mixed with pure, distilled fear. This was not about saving money. It was about systemic gatekeeping. It was about viewing my family, my child, as a liability to be managed, not a life to be saved. "Elective?" I repeated, the word tasting like rust. "Are you saying my 7-year-old choosing to breathe is elective?" Wakefield adopted a patronizing tone, the kind men use when explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "Look, Mrs. Hayes, we see these high-pressure situations frequently. Hospitals push these expensive, aggressive procedures when cheaper, less invasive alternatives are available. The medical reviewer believes a course of drug therapy and monitoring is appropriate for the next 6 months. 6 months of waiting meant 6 months of Daniel's heart degrading. 6 months of living on borrowed time. Just to save OmniSecure $250,000. There is no cheaper alternative for this specific anatomical issue. I pushed back, fighting to keep my voice even. I have read the policy documentation. I know what medically necessary means under Section D4. This meets the criteria. Wakefield chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that scraped against my nerves. Oh, you read the policy. That's sweet, Mrs. Hayes. But I am the policy in this instance. And frankly, your persistence suggests you might be trying to abuse the system. Our auditors review claims constantly for fraud and misuse of high-value services. Perhaps you should consider the gravity of pushing this. Abuse the system, fraud, misuse. That was the moment the mother in me, panicked and desperate, took a back seat. The professional stepped forward, cold, calm, and utterly ruthless. Wakefield had no idea who he was talking to. He saw a desperate, emotional black mother begging for approval, easy to dismiss and threaten with the specter of fraud. He didn't see Sarah Hayes. He didn't see the woman who, for the last 10 years, had been employed by the U.S. government as a senior federal auditor, specializing in regulatory compliance and investigative auditing, with a primary focus on large-scale medical billing fraud and corporate overbilling schemes. I didn't just read the policy, Mr. Wakefield. I often helped write the federal guidelines that policed companies like yours. I knew where the cracks were. I knew where the bodies were buried. And I knew the exact legal threshold that separated incompetence from criminal enterprise. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that this denial was not incompetence. This was calculated systemic abuse, leveraging the pain of the vulnerable for profit. I understand, Mr. Wakefield, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming flat and dangerous. You have denied the life-critical surgery for my son based on your assessment of medical necessity and excessive cost. That is correct, he confirmed, sounding smug. You may file a standard appeal, which will take another 60 to 90 days for review. Have a nice day. He hung up before I could reply. I stood there, the dull dial tone buzzing in my ear. The panic was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The exhaustion vanished. They wanted 90 days. They wanted an appeal that would drag out until Daniel was gravely ill? No, that wasn't the path I would take. The standard process was designed to wear down the weak, to make them give up or accept subpar care. I wasn't weak. I wasn't giving up. And I had a pathway around their appeal structure that would shatter their company. My hands, though steady now, still gripped the phone. I looked down the hall at Daniel, coloring quietly in his chair. They denied Daniel his life. I straightened my spine, pulling my dignity around me like a shield. I walked immediately out of the hospital, leaving Daniel with my sister who was arriving shortly. I drove home. I locked the front door. I didn't open the appeals paperwork. I bypassed the standard channels completely. Instead, I went directly to the secure server cabinet in my home office. I logged into my federal workstation. I pulled up the internal database access codes and the special designation forms. The adjuster had threatened me with fraud investigation. He had accused me of trying to abuse the system. He had no idea that I was about to file a federal indictment against his entire company, using their internal documentation and billing practices as my primary evidence. I was not going to appeal his decision. I was going to adjust his entire reality. The first step was identifying his superior, the exact chain of command involved in the corporate strategy behind these deliberate denials. I typed in the search query for OmniSecure Health's highest-ranking executives and regulatory filings. The hunt had begun, and it wasn't going to stop until every single person involved in this cruel decision was facing the justice they deserved. starting with Mr. Wakefield. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. The fluorescent hospital lights seemed too bright, too clinical. They hurt my eyes. I looked down at Ethan. He was drowsy, half awake, clutching the tattered superhero blanket Grandma knitted him years ago. He needed that surgery. He needed it now. Wallace Sterling, the voice on the other end, had denied it with the sterile cruelty of someone adjusting inventory. Pre-existing condition, experimental procedure, lack of medical necessity. The lies were standard issue. For 1 minute, I was just a mother, consumed by fear and the searing heat of injustice. I felt the familiar weight of being dismissed, the assumption that I was powerless. Then the feeling stopped. The tears dried instantly. The shift was immediate, physical. The mother retreated, and the auditor took over. I kissed Ethan gently on the forehead. "Mommy has to go make a phone call, baby. A very important one." I wasn't calling a supervisor at Omnia Health Corp. I wasn't appealing to Wallace Sterling's better nature, a nature I was now certain didn't exist. I was going to work. I drove out of the hospital district. My personal car, a quiet, unremarkable sedan, blended into the late afternoon traffic. No one would ever guess what I actually did for a living, based on the car I drove or the clothes I wore. I wasn't a claims specialist. I wasn't a billing clerk. My title was Technical Lead for Systemic Fraud Review, Federal Oversight Division. I specialized in auditing medical conglomerates, specifically when their cost-saving measures morphed into criminal patient abandonment. My jurisdiction wasn't limited to state lines. It covered any entity receiving federal funds for patient care, which included nearly every major insurer in the country. My office was the one called when the state attorneys general realized the fraud they were investigating was too big, too deeply rooted, and stretched across too many jurisdictions for them to handle alone. I handled the $50 million cases, the systemic ones, the ones that hurt thousands of people. Wallace Sterling had just made my child one of those thousands. I pulled into the underground garage of a secure building downtown. It wasn't the main federal building. It was a private floor, leased under a shell corporation, used exclusively for the most sensitive, high-risk investigations. I unlocked the double-plated steel door. The air inside was cool, sterile, and quiet. I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk, the one that looked like standard government surplus, but housed $500,000 of custom-built secured hardware. I didn't open my personal laptop. I opened the secure, encrypted terminal. The login process required 3 physical keys and retinal scans. This was where the real work happened. I typed in the search query, Omnia Health Corp, Wallace Sterling, adjuster code 779B. My access was instantaneous and total. I bypassed the standard HR files and claims databases. I went straight to the secure federal repository where all audited medical communications were stored, a firewall no civilian company could ever breach. I wasn't looking at Ethan's file anymore. I was looking at Wallace Sterling's entire claims history for the last 3 years. He handled hundreds of denials every month, standard procedure. But as I began pulling the metadata, filtering the denied claims based on specific parameters, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I filtered for high-cost critical care claims denied on the grounds of medical necessity. Then I filtered the denial recipients by zip code, specifically low-income zip codes, across 3 major metropolitan areas in the region. The pattern was overwhelming. Wallace Sterling wasn't just a heartless adjuster. He was an instrument in a calculated denial matrix. 95% of his denials in the last 18 months targeted patients in specific highly vulnerable demographics. These were people less likely to have lawyers, less likely to know the appeals process, and far less likely to challenge an insurance giant in court. They were denied quickly, coldly, and systematically. I pulled up the denial reason code he used for Ethan. Z44A. Unproven efficacy in pediatric cases. I cross-referenced that code against 10,000 other denials Sterling had issued. Every claim for high-cost pediatric care in those low-income zip codes was slapped with Z44A. No deviation, no individualized review. It took me less than 30 minutes to confirm what I suspected. Wallace Sterling wasn't reviewing claims. He was implementing a quota, a systematic automated refusal of life-saving care designed to inflate corporate profits at the direct expense of the poor and the marginalized. It was fraud on a spectacular, criminal scale. I stared at the screen, my expression flat. It wasn't enough to get Ethan's surgery approved. That would be a favor, a concession. They had targeted my child because they assumed his mother was defenseless. They assumed she was one of the statistics. I realized then that this investigation would not be handled by the standard federal teams. This one would be personal. This specific case, involving my son, would be the foundational anchor for the indictment. That would dismantle Omnia Health Corp. Entirely. I reached for the secure red phone, the line that connected me directly to the Department of Justice's Medical Fraud Division. I knew who to call. I knew exactly what information to feed them to secure the fastest, deepest audit team deployment possible. But first, I needed to make sure I had everything I needed to destroy Wallace Sterling's career before the sun rose, not just as a necessary part of the indictment, but as a deliberate, poetic footnote. He was going to regret hearing my voice today. I opened a separate, highly restricted access portal to the Internal Revenue Service files. If you want to find the root of criminal medical fraud, you follow the money. I typed in Sterling's name and accessed his personal financial disclosure forms. I needed to see if Wallace was just a pawn or a beneficiary of the system he enforced. If he had benefited personally from denying critical care to those who needed it most, the hammer would fall much harder. The file loaded. His salary was average for an adjuster, but there was a detail listed under annual bonuses and incentives that made my breathing catch. A 7-figure bonus tied directly to achieving net savings milestones. The milestone wasn't about saving the company money ethically. It was quantified based on the percentage of high-cost claims successfully denied and shut down. Wallace Sterling was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure children like Ethan didn't get the care they needed. He was guilty, and now I had his incentive in writing. I took a breath, the cold focus tightening. I started composing the preliminary audit report. It would be fast. It would be ruthless. I would make sure that the people who signed Wallace Sterling's bonus checks, the executives who profited from the pain of sick children, would be the next names on the indictment list. But first, Wallace Sterling needed to feel the weight of what he had done. He needed to be the canary in the coal mine. I needed to know where he lived, where he ate his lunch, where he felt safe. I had the means to find out everything, and I decided right then that when the indictment dropped, I would be the one to serve him the papers. Quietly, in person. I watched the front door lock itself, the heavy thud of the deadbolt, signaling not just security, but a shift in identity. The mother who cried in Sterling's office was gone. Now, only the auditor remained. I peeled off the expensive conservative suit I wore to try and convince them I belonged. It was strategy, attempting to meet their ridiculous standard of respectability. It didn't work. It never does. I moved down the hall, past Leo's room, where the light under the door was still glowing. My heart ached, but the grief was compartmentalized, sealed away behind steel doors. That panic was fuel now, not hindrance. My home office is not a typical room. It is a bunker. When you deal with the level of institutional corruption that I handle for the government, you do not use civilian equipment. I logged into the secured systems. The server fans hummed a low, constant note. The sound of impending federal scrutiny. I had the claims file, Leo's E3 submission, marked for urgent pediatric orthopedic surgery. Right next to it was Sterling's denial summary, procedure deemed experimental for patient profile, lack of longitudinal evidence. I typed Omnia Health into the internal database. The screen immediately filled with color-coded warnings. Omnia was already flagged, sitting right in the second percentile for suspicious activity. They were on the watch list for high-volume claim rejection among specific zip codes and demographic subsets. It was exactly what I expected. The system is designed to choke out the poor, the vulnerable, the black and brown families seeking complex care. I didn't need to hunt for smoking guns. I was looking for the entire armory. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling the denial data for all high-cost pediatric surgeries over the last 3 fiscal quarters. I filtered the results immediately by race and income metrics. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was a hammer blow. For white children in high-income brackets, the denial rate for the specific procedure Leo needed was under 8%. For children who looked like Leo, whose files originated from his neighborhood clinic, the rate soared past 40%. 40. It wasn't bad judgment. It was corporate arithmetic. I looked closer at the specific adjuster who signed off on Leo's life, Marcus Sterling. I pulled his profile, not just his HR file, but the confidential performance reviews tied to his departmental cost-saving bonuses. These were records the company thought were buried under layers of corporate privilege and privacy law. But they weren't buried from me. Sterling had received significant, highly leveraged bonuses for meeting efficiency targets related to high-cost claims reduction. His performance reviews were glowing, specifically citing his aggressive application of the experimental procedure clause to complex pediatric cases. The man wasn't just cruel. He was paid to be cruel. His promotion depended on starving my son of necessary care. This was no longer a personal grievance against one callous man. This was institutional, systemic, organized fraud designed to maximize shareholder profit by withholding medically necessary care from vulnerable populations. I opened the new case folder on my federal drive. I named it simply Omnia Health Investigation, Structured Fraud and Discriminatory Practices. I began organizing the evidence under specific statutes. Title 18, Section 1347, Healthcare Fraud. Violations of the Civil Rights Act related to discriminatory denial of services. Potential RICO charges for the systemic use of denial to generate illicit financial gain. I knew exactly what I needed to prove. Not just that Leo was denied, but that the denial was part of a larger, engineered corporate structure aimed at theft through discrimination. I printed nothing. Every action was logged and time-stamped within the secured system, creating a chain of custody that no corporate legal team could ever break. I worked until the first light of dawn began to creep through the slits of the reinforced windows. I had compiled the initial indictment package, 150 pages of irrefutable data points, internal memos, and cross-referenced denial statistics. It was enough to shut down their entire pediatric division immediately. It was enough to bury Marcus Sterling under federal charges for the next 2 decades. But it wasn't enough for me yet. The true impact, the poetic justice I craved, demanded the timing be perfect. I wanted to see the panic in their eyes, to feel the cold, sharp reversal of power. I needed to make sure the evidence hit the desk of the U.S. Attorney General at the exact moment it would cause maximum disruption, maximum humiliation. I closed the system with a final, silent click. Leo needed his surgery. I needed to ensure this injustice never happened to another child. First, I had to ensure Omnia thought they had won. I had one more desperate, final attempt planned to go directly back to Sterling, not to beg, but to set the final trap. The numbers had become my second language. a cold, flat dialect of denial. I sat in my home office, the only light coming from the three stacked monitors, showing spreadsheets that scrolled endlessly into the dark. Outside, the world was asleep. Inside, I was wide awake, tracing the architecture of Apex Jaw's systemic cruelty. It wasn't just Micah's CPT code they had flagged incorrectly. It was hundreds, then thousands. I found the pattern hidden within the complexity. It was a subtle, deliberate misclassification strategy. They weren't denying claims outright, in a way that would trigger an immediate internal appeal flag. They were shuffling them into a gray area of experimental, non-essential. This categorization demanded mountains of extra documentation. Documentation they knew desperate families, exhausted from fighting for months, could rarely provide perfectly on time. Apex sure didn't want to save money by rejecting claims. They wanted to save money by making claims impossible to fulfill. This wasn't incompetence. This was calculated cruelty, written into their core profit model. I cross-referenced the denial logs with the demographic data I wasn't supposed to have access to. But my old contacts at the agency were surprisingly loyal when they saw the preliminary evidence. The results were chilling. The claims pushed into this experimental, non-essential black hole were overwhelmingly clustered in specific zip codes, low income, high minority areas. They were systematically targeting those least likely to have the resources for high-powered legal fights or the time to navigate complex medical bureaucracy. It was theft, disguised as bureaucracy, fraud, layered in plausible deniability. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. The face of Mr. Thorne, the adjuster who had sent that final dismissive email, flashed in my mind. He was just a functionary, a cog, but he was the face I had seen when I feared my son might not make it. I pulled up his personnel file. Thorne had been promoted twice in the last 3 years. His performance metrics showed incredible efficiency in cost management and risk mitigation. Risk mitigation, in Apex Shore's language, meant maximizing strategic denials. The colder I became professionally, the hotter the fire burned beneath my skin. I remembered last spring when Micah had that terrifying asthma attack, the kind that leaves you trembling even after the crisis passes. He was 6, clutching his small chest, trying to pull air into lungs that refused to cooperate. I had rocked him in the hospital chair, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Promises that I would protect him from everything, even the air itself. Now, the thing trying to hurt him wasn't the air. It was a spreadsheet managed by a man named Thorne. The surgery wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't elective. It was corrective. It would give him years of relief, maybe even a normal life. Thorne had signed off on the rejection 2 days before Micah's 7th birthday. I turned back to the monitors, focusing on the wider operation. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that Thorne wasn't running the show. He was executing the play calls. The real target was higher. I needed to know who authored the specific denial algorithms, who implemented the coding changes in the 3rd quarter of last year, the exact moment Apex Sure's profits had spiked dramatically, coinciding with a sudden surge in denials for essential pediatric procedures. I found the signatures on the internal memos. Executive Vice President of Operations, Arthur Jennings. Jennings was a different beast, a high-profile public figure, often featured in financial magazines, talking about optimizing healthcare efficiency. He wasn't an adjuster denying one claim. He was the architect of denying thousands. To indict Jennings, I needed more than statistical correlation. I needed internal communications. I needed proof that the intent was malicious, not merely financially conservative. My team, the federal auditors I worked with remotely, was moving carefully. They were already initiating standard inquiries into Apex Shore's competitor agencies, gathering baseline data so the focus on Apex Shore wouldn't look immediately retaliatory or personal. We called it the shadow review phase. It was slow, methodical, and painfully necessary. I knew that Jennings would have layers of corporate lawyers protecting him. They would call the coding changes proprietary financial strategy. They would dismiss the demographic disparity as coincidence. My indictment couldn't just wound them, it had to be a nuclear strike. I started analyzing Jennings' financial disclosures. People who build systems of systematic denial usually operate systems of systematic reward for themselves. Where did Jennings invest? What shell corporations did he use for bonuses? His compensation package showed millions in performance incentives tied directly to cost savings through reduced claim expenditures. Reduced claim expenditures at the expense of children like Micah. I typed a secure message to my primary contact, Agent Torres. I summarized the Jennings connection, detailing the algorithm changes and the evidence of targeted demographic impact. Torres: I am ready to move from analysis to evidence acquisition. We need internal email access. We need the true meeting minutes regarding the Q3 coding shift. Torres replied immediately, her usual clipped efficiency present even in the text. Torres: the warrant process is delicate. We cannot show our hand too early. We need an actionable pretext, something concrete they can't dismiss as a fishing expedition. I stared at the screen, understanding. I couldn't just raid them because I knew they were criminals. I needed to find the specific thread of fraud that would legally unravel the entire tapestry. I shifted my focus back to Thorne. He was the entry point. He was the one who personally humiliated me. He was the one I would use to unlock Jennings' vault. I found a discrepancy in Thorne's documentation for another similar case. A young girl in a different state, denied surgery under the exact same false classification. But in that girl's file, Thorne had added a handwritten note on a digital sticky pad buried deep in the metadata. A note intended for a superior. I zoomed in, holding my breath. The text was short, sloppy. Pushed through 8K per AJ directive. Needs follow-up. AJ Arthur Jennings, and pushed through 8K, not dollars. It was a reference code, a secret internal tracking metric. This was the pretext. This was the specific, actionable hook I needed to open the doors to the entire Apex Shore operation. I felt a quiet, terrible satisfaction settle over me. I wasn't just fighting for Micah anymore. I was fighting for every mother Thorne had dismissed, every child Jennings had quantified into insolvency. The game had officially changed from auditing to indictment. I closed the files on Thorne and Jennings, stood up from the desk, and walked quietly down the hall to check on my sleeping son. He was tucked deep under the covers, his breathing steady, innocent of the storm I was building on his behalf. I kissed his forehead. The audit was over. The investigation had begun. And tomorrow, I had to decide which specific federal statute would bury Arthur Jennings first. The conference room had no windows. The air was cold, scented with ozone from the servers, just screens glowing blue in the dim light. I had called in Elena, my lead analyst, and Mr. Davies, the Department of Justice liaison assigned to my long-term investigation files. This was no longer a routine audit. This was a targeted strike. I needed to move Omnia Health from the priority investigation file to the immediate indictment file. The timeline was no longer measured in quarters. It was measured in hours. The claim denial code used for Caleb, I stated, tapping the holographic display. Code 84B, insufficient medical necessity. Eleanor pulled the company-wide usage data instantly. That specific denial code spiked 400% in the last 2 quarters, Aisha. It almost exclusively affects high-cost procedures. And the demographics of the denied claims? I asked. I watched the projection map change color, highlighting areas of deprivation and high minority populations. The correlation was immediate and sickening. geographical clustering, income bracket correlation. They were systematically denying critical claims in specific underserved areas. Areas just like mine. It wasn't merely incompetence or poor management. It was optimized, algorithmic fraud. They were gambling on the raw desperation of their policyholders. They bet that families facing immediate medical crises would not have the time, the energy, or the legal access to fight a complex coded denial. They bet on exhaustion. They bet on poverty. They bet on us giving up. I looked at the statistics, cold and clear. Every percentage point represented a person suffering because a spreadsheet dictated that human life was too expensive. Then we pulled Mr. Robert Sterling's file, senior claims adjuster, 22 years at Omnia. His digital paper trail was pristine. No official reprimands, just a consistent history of aggressively meeting cost containment metrics. His real job was never to approve claims. His job was to generate friction and anxiety, to deny claims until the patient either gave up or, hopefully for Omnia, died, removing the liability entirely. He was the efficient frontline weapon in their corporate cruelty. I scrolled through his social media, carefully scrubbed but revealing enough. Yacht pictures, golf course boasts, a man living large off the premium dollars he collected and the critical claims he deliberately strangled. His professional arrogance was built on the foundation of other people's despair. "Mr. Davies," I said, leaning back, the metal chair squeaking softly, "we are not going after the foot soldier alone. Sterling's denial is the keystone to the arch. We are going straight for the CEO and the board of directors." Davies nodded slowly, his face grim in the monitor light. "Omnia is too big for a quick civil suit, Aisha. We need a massive RICO filing coupled with the medical fraud allegations. We have to prove a pattern of racketeering. This is going to shut down the company entirely, not just fine it." "Good," I replied. "That is the goal. Justice for Caleb cannot be purchased with a settlement check. It must be delivered through systemic destruction." The hospital called again late that evening. The surgeon was preparing the OR schedule for the following week. They needed the insurance authorization within the next few days. The clock was ticking, a loud metallic hammer against my resolve. I felt the familiar sharp clutch of panic. I immediately crushed it with calculation. Panic was useless. Action was survival. I had already secured private funding for Caleb's procedure. I drained every available retirement account and equity line. My son would have his surgery regardless of Omnia's decision. This fight was no longer about his coverage. It was about proving that the system designed to protect us could not be weaponized against us without severe consequence. I worked 18 hours straight, existing on stale coffee and pure, humming adrenaline. I reviewed Omnia's internal memoranda. These had been secured through a broad wiretap and warrant I had authorized 6 months prior during a parallel investigation into their Medicare abuse practices. Everything was aligning perfectly. Sterling's denial was not an accident. It was standard operating procedure. That was the crime. The indictment draft was staggering. It detailed billions of dollars in fraudulent activity, structured specifically to target low-income and minority policyholders. We had internal emails, meeting minutes, and performance reviews that specifically rewarded adjusters like Sterling for meeting those inhuman denial quotas. The physical document weighed 6 pounds when printed. It wasn't just paper. It was undeniable evidence of systemic corporate malice. I read the opening line aloud for effect. "The United States of America versus Omnia Health Group, Incasio et al." It felt solid, real, final. "We file this at 9:00 a.m. sharp on Monday," I instructed Elena, "the precise moment the market opens." "Sterling will be the first to receive the subpoena and the arrest warrant," Davies confirmed, his voice low. "Delivered right to his luxury apartment door." I paused. looking at the timestamp in the lower corner of the screen. Sunday afternoon. Less than 20 hours until the world shifted under Omnia's feet. I thought about Mr. Sterling, signing off on Caleb's life without a second thought, dismissing my entire existence as an inconvenience to his vacation fund. He thought he was powerful. He was just a piece of evidence. And I was the one submitting the final report to the grand jury. I closed the file, the silence in the room deafening. I needed to go home and see Caleb. But first, one final crucial step remained before I set the legal bomb off. I needed the final sworn testimony of the whistleblower. The woman we had cultivated deep inside Omnia's executive suite for the past year. She was waiting for my call, ready to confirm the inner workings of their denial machine. Everything hinged on her final statement. The clock officially started ticking the moment the final signatures dried on the indictment. It was a quiet morning for me. For Mr. Hendricks, it was the loudest moment of his career. I did not have to be there. I did not want to be there. But my contacts provided a perfect real-time picture of the chaos I had meticulously engineered. Veritas Insurance had been arrogant for too long. They believed they were too big, too complex, too protected by layers of expensive lawyers. They were wrong. They had forgotten that bureaucracy is only armor until a specialist learns how to dismantle it piece by piece. The first wave hit at 8 a.m. Sharp. It wasn't a subpoena delivered via certified mail. It was a tactical, overwhelming deployment. 30 federal agents, wearing the insignias of 3 different regulatory bodies, simultaneously entered the Veritas headquarters in 3 separate cities. They didn't ask for files. They didn't wait in the lobby. They arrived with pre-signed judicial warrants and armed guards. The internal email system crashed within minutes. My team, already embedded in a shadow office miles away, had provided the warrants with granular detail. Which servers to seize, which employee terminals to target, and exactly where the encrypted communication logs were hidden. The key targets were the claims processing department and the executive suite. Mr. Hendricks's floor, the 17th, was sealed off immediately. He must have been sitting at his desk, drinking his lukewarm coffee, preparing to deny some other desperate claim. Then, the agents were there. Not aggressive, but utterly immovable. I heard later that when they asked Mr. Hendricks to surrender his phone and step away from his computer, he actually laughed. He thought it was a drill, a joke. His laugh died when the agent in charge presented the warrant, naming him, personally, as a person of interest in a massive, multi-state medical claims fraud investigation. My focus had not been on a single racial discrimination lawsuit, though that was the emotional core. My focus was on the structure of their fraud. We had the receipts, 300,000 claims, stretching back 7 years, categorized by approval percentage versus zip code income and minority density. The statistical anomaly was not an anomaly. It was a policy, a deliberate, profit-driven system of neglect and denial targeted at vulnerable populations. The moment the news hit the financial wires, the true panic began. Veritas stock dropped 22% in the first hour of trading. That drop was the market's immediate, brutal realization that this was not a dispute with the policyholder. This was a war with the federal government, fought on terms set entirely by the opposition. They couldn't contain the narrative. The investigators were efficient. They weren't looking for one smoking gun. They were collecting the entire armory. They knew the specific coding structure Veritas used to automatically flag high-cost claims from low-income areas for manual review and subsequent denial by adjusters like Mr. Hendricks. It was the system that designated Caleb's essential pediatric neurosurgery as experimental and non-essential. It was a policy written in profit margins, stained by deliberate cruelty. I sat in my quiet apartment, looking at Caleb's breathing monitor. He was stable, but the weight had taken its toll. I felt cold, not triumphant. This was necessary surgery, surgical justice. The insurance company wasn't just going to pay for Caleb's procedure now. They were going to finance the destruction of their own criminal enterprise. By mid-afternoon, the Veritas CEO was on mandatory administrative leave. The legal department was hemorrhaging lawyers, scrambling to understand the depth of the procedural rot I had exposed. They couldn't fight it because they couldn't deny the data. I had used their own internal accounting and risk metrics against them. Mr. Hendricks wasn't laughing anymore. He was trapped in an emergency conference room with a corporate lawyer who was realizing just how little he had been paid for this kind of disaster. He was the sacrificial lamb, perfectly positioned. He had denied Caleb's claim with a smug, classist dismissal. He had left a paper trail littered with unprofessional, discriminatory notations that I had flagged specifically for the prosecutors. My team had ensured that Mr. Hendricks's full case history, including the note where he referenced my son's name and location, describing us as high-risk, low-yield clientele, was the very first exhibit presented to the court. He had not just denied a child a surgery, he had violated a dozen federal guidelines, and his hubris had gifted me the foundational evidence needed to sink the entire ship. I received a confidential internal report later that evening. Mr. Hendricks was not arrested immediately. That would have been too quick. He was placed on permanent unpaid suspension, escorted out of the building, and informed that every single claims decision he had ever made was now subject to forensic audit. He was professionally dead, morally indicted, and legally compromised. The last piece of information I needed confirmed. The hospital's finance department had received a priority wire transfer from Veritas's emergency reserve fund, covering Caleb's surgery in full, plus a 500% penalty premium. No explanation, no apology, just the terrified payment. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The criminal investigation was just beginning, and many more powerful people were about to fall. But the arrogant adjuster, who thought my desperation was a weapon he could wield against me, had just become a footnote in the biggest medical fraud indictment of the decade. I still had one decision left to make concerning Mr. Hendricks. The authorities had their path, but I had mine. Should I let the impersonal hand of justice crush him, or did I owe him one last personal acknowledgement of his grave error? I closed my laptop and focused entirely on the gentle, steady beep of Caleb's monitoring device. The time for quiet planning was ending. The time for the recovery, in all its forms, was about to begin. The time between the filing of the indictment and the hammer dropping was the strangest week of my life. It was a quiet period, too quiet. I was back in the hospital, reading to Noah, tracing the lines of his small, beautiful hand. The paperwork was gone from my immediate attention, replaced by the reality of his breathing and the machines that kept watch. But the federal investigation machine, once engaged, does not stop for quiet weeks. It only moves in silence until the moment of maximum impact. They told me to stay home, to keep low. They wanted no leaks, no warnings. I followed every instruction. I was a professional after all. Then, Tuesday morning, it broke. I was watching the national news feed, not looking for my story, just trying to distract myself with global events. Suddenly, the scrolling headline changed. Omnisure Insurance Headquarters raided. Massive medical billing fraud indictment filed by DOJ. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just exhaled a breath I felt I had been holding since Stephen Rourke said, "We'll be denying that claim." The footage was stark. Dozens of agents, wearing protective vests and carrying folders, swarmed the gleaming lobby of the Omnisure Tower. The sight of the glass doors, the same doors I had walked through to deliver my initial findings years ago, being held open by federal marshals was deeply satisfying. The initial reports focused on the CEO and the CFO being immediately placed on administrative leave. Board members were resigning in real time. But I knew where the real infection lay. It was in the hands-on denial structure, the systematic refusal of care based on demographics. I received a call from Agent Garcia, the lead prosecutor. His voice was calm, almost bored. This was just another day for him. Aisha, it's done. We are securing thousands of documents. The data you provided was precise. They didn't stand a chance. He paused. We found the internal memos, Aisha, the ones detailing the risk management protocols for claims in specific zip codes. They explicitly targeted low-income minority applicants for automatic denial. I closed my eyes. It wasn't just Noah. It was systemic. It was deliberate policy written into their business model. What about Rourke? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Garcia chuckled, a dry sound. Stephen Rourke is having a bad day, Aisha, a very bad day. His cubicle is currently a crime scene. He explained that Rourke's department had handled the bulk of the initial denials flagged in my audit. Rourke was not the mastermind, but he was a critical cog. He was the foot soldier who enthusiastically carried out the racist mandates for a bonus. They had his personal notes, his digital history, his emails complaining about having to deal with charity cases. The entitlement of these people was breathtaking. They assumed their digital paper trail would never see the light of day. They assumed their victims would be too poor, too uneducated, or too exhausted to ever fight back effectively. They didn't assume their victim's mother was the woman who wrote the book on catching them. The next day, OmniShore's stock dropped by 50%. By the end of the week, the company was facing insolvency and the threat of total national dissolution. My attorney, Mr. Davies, called me, elated. The civil case, Aisha? It's over. They settled within minutes of the indictment hitting the news wires. We didn't even have to argue for punitive damages. The settlement was substantial, enough for Noah's surgery, his rehabilitation, and his college education twice over. But the money was irrelevant now. The primary goal was the surgery, and that was immediately scheduled. The second goal was accountability. I wanted Rourke to understand the human cost of his negligence and prejudice. I didn't want him jailed for the rest of his life, but I wanted his privilege stripped bare. I wanted him to lose his house, his easy life, his quiet arrogance. That evening, I watched the local news. They showed Rourke leaving the federal building, flanked by his distraught-looking lawyer. He looked small. His suit was rumpled. His face was pale and drawn. He was crying, actually crying, into his phone. He was experiencing the consequences of failure for the first time in his pampered, protected life. The humiliation was complete. But then, the newscaster said something that brought the focus back to me. Sources confirmed that Stephen Rourke attempted to contact Aisha Green, the mother who originally filed the claim earlier today, but was denied access by federal authorities. Rourke knew. He knew who I was. He knew that the black mother he dismissed was the architect of his downfall. He must have pulled my original claim file, looked up the names, and made the connection. I smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that didn't reach my eyes. The adjuster wanted to meet the auditor. He wanted to apologize, or perhaps beg. I thought about his expression when he first denied us, the casual cruelty in his eyes, the dismissive wave of his hand. I picked up my own phone and called Mr. Davies. "Rourke wants to meet me?" I asked. Davies sighed. "He's terrified, Aisha. He's trying to mitigate damages. You don't have to do it. You shouldn't do it." I looked at Noah, sleeping soundly in the hospital bed, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. His surgery was only days away. "No," I said firmly. "I won't meet him in court, or in a deposition, or even in a federal building." Davis waited. "Tell Stephen Rourke that he can meet me at the hospital coffee shop tomorrow afternoon. Tell him to bring his own coffee. I'll give him 5 minutes. I hung up before Davies could argue. I needed to look him in the eye one last time. I needed him to know that the judgment against him was personal, professional, and entirely earned. I needed him to understand the cost of underestimating a black mother fighting for her child's life. Tomorrow, the final act would be performed. The federal case broke Zenith Health into pieces. The initial shock of the search warrants had been one thing. The release of the indictment's findings was a total collapse. It wasn't just about refusing claims. That happens every day. Anya's indictment detailed the systematic implementation of a denial optimization matrix. It was a cold algorithm designed by corporate executives, fine-tuned over years. The algorithm flagged patients based on specific non-medical metrics: neighborhood zip codes, average household income, and historical frequency of high-cost claims in those demographics. In short, it targeted poor people. It targeted black and brown families. The system labeled these claims as high denial probability assets. Bartholomew wasn't just following policy. He was implementing a sophisticated, coded system of economic racism. The indictment cited internal emails from Zenith's CEO congratulating teams for successfully hitting denial rate targets in specific inner-city markets. They celebrated their efficiency in maximizing profits by sacrificing human health. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. This wasn't just insurance fraud. It was a moral outrage disguised as market efficiency. When the Attorney General held the press conference, he didn't use jargon. He spoke plainly. Zenith Health weaponized data to deny critical care to the most vulnerable patients, he said. They treated human lives as liabilities. The evidence, which Anya had painstakingly catalogued over 6 months, was undeniable. Dozens of patients came forward, their stories echoing Kai's. Children needing urgent procedures, elderly patients denied life-saving treatments, all systematically rejected by the denial optimization matrix. The narrative shifted entirely. Bartholomew was no longer the sole villain. He was a cog, but an enthusiastic one, in a truly monstrous machine. He was arrested late one afternoon at a coffee shop near his suburban home. He didn't resist. His world had dissolved into the white noise of flashbulbs and legal paperwork. When he finally saw Anya again, it was in a sterile conference room in the Department of Justice headquarters. She wasn't prosecuting him. She was there as the lead federal auditor, ensuring the compliance and seizure of assets were executed flawlessly. Bartholomew looked pale, diminished. He wore a cheap suit and a look of profound disbelief. He still didn't understand that the rules had changed. "Miss Anya," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "This is overkill. I followed protocol. You know how the industry works." Anya looked down at the documents laid out on the table, the records detailing Zenith's assets, the forfeiture agreement. "You called my son's life frivolous, Mr. Bartholomew," she said, her voice flat, official. "You implemented a denial based on his mother's zip code, not his heart condition." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She opened a folder containing an email she had specifically saved. It was one of the many pieces of evidence. It was Bartholomew's response to a colleague after denying Kai's initial surgery claim. Subject line: "Another bullet dodged." The body read, "High-risk demographic handled. Saved the company 6 figures. Enjoy your weekend." She pushed the printout across the table. "You enjoyed it," Anya stated. "You took pleasure in denying a child medical care that you knew he desperately needed." Bartholomew stared at the email, his past arrogance hitting him like physical force. He tried to defend himself, his lips trembling. "That was just corporate humor. I swear. We all did it. It was pressure." "There is no humor in systemic cruelty, Mr. Bartholomew," Anya finished. "And the pressure you felt was to maximize profit. The pressure I felt was to keep my child alive. She signaled to the DOJ attorney in the room. Her part in this immediate confrontation was over. She didn't stay to watch him sign the documents or plea bargain. That detail was beneath her. Zenith Health was forced into emergency receivership. The executives were facing years of litigation and potential jail time. Massive financial penalties were levied. And most importantly, the court issued an immediate injunction requiring Zenith's remaining assets to establish a special medical trust fund. This fund was designated specifically to cover the claims unjustly denied by the fraudulent matrix, prioritizing critical care for children. Kai's claim was immediately approved and paid in full by the newly mandated trust. A week later, Kai was wheeled into the operating room. Anya watched the surgeons, their movements precise and confident. The stress of the past year melted slightly, replaced by a quiet, agonizing hope. The surgery was long. She sat in the waiting room, not thinking about Bartholomew or the indictment, but about the rhythm of her son's small heart. When the surgeon finally emerged smiling, the relief was so profound it made her knees weak. Successful, the surgeon reported. A full recovery expected. The congenital defect is repaired. Anya closed her eyes. Justice, she realized, was complex. The justice she sought for the systemic racism she exposed felt cold and hard. But the justice she felt right now, watching her son wake up, safe and whole, was warm and absolute. It was the quiet victory that mattered the most. Months later, Anya stood on the deck of her new home. It was a modest but beautiful house, purchased after the DOJ recognized her pivotal role in securing the largest medical fraud settlement in a decade. The settlement allowed her to relocate, to finally give Kai the stable, safe environment she had always dreamed of. Kai was outside, laughing, chasing a small dog in the yard. He ran without strain, without the shortness of breath that had haunted his early years. He was vibrant. He was healthy. Anya was scheduled to testify before a Senate subcommittee next month, detailing how algorithms could be weaponized against minorities in healthcare and housing. Her work was far from over. The systems she fought were vast, entrenched, and constantly evolving. But she had learned a crucial lesson. The arrogance of the powerful often blinded them to the competence of the underestimated. They had seen a worried black mother fighting for a claim. They had completely missed the federal auditor with the surgical precision and the absolute moral clarity. The fight had cost her peace, but it had bought her son his life. Anya watched Kai catch the dog and fall in the grass, his laughter echoing. Clearly across the yard, the old weight was gone, replaced by a new, focused resolve. The cleanup had begun, but the deep work of restructuring the broken system was still ahead. She still had files to review, corporations to investigate, and a quiet promise to keep to every mother who had been denied, just like her. She smiled faintly. The next phase was beginning.